So Merriam-Webster.com defines trust this way, as a noun: assured reliance on the character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something. Assured reliance of the character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something. Cambridge Dictionary defines it as a verb this way: to believe someone is good and honest and will not harm you, or that something is safe and reliable. Here's the deal. Regardless of how you define trust, there is definitely a lack of it in our culture today. Nobody trusts anybody. We don't trust the news media. We don't trust our government. We don't trust our neighbors. We don't trust our co-workers. We don't trust our friends. We don't trust our family. And we don't trust God, and we don't trust the church. And in fact, we're having a hard time even learning and figuring out how to trust ourselves. But yet, as we are exploring and learning and finding out through this series, trust is the fuel for all of life, and especially relationships, at least according to Dr. Cloud in his book called Trust, where he says this. He says, all of life depends on this one thing: trust. And I would have to agree with him, because as we saw a couple weeks ago, we see the Holy Scriptures also say that we are wired to trust. It's just a part of who we are. Researcher Roderick Kramer says this. He says human beings are naturally predisposed to trust. It's in our genes and our childhood learning. And by and large, it's a survival mechanism that has served our species well. That said, our willingness often gets us into trouble. He says, moreover, we sometimes have difficulty distinguishing trustworthy people from untrustworthy ones. At a species level, though, he says that doesn't matter much so long as more people are trustworthy than not. At the individual level, though, he says it can be a real problem. And the truth of the matter is, trust at any level can be a real problem, because we've all trusted in someone or something that we wish that we hadn't done that. So the real question is this: how do we know? How do we know who we can trust and who we cannot trust? Well, today we're continuing in our Just Trust Me series, and we're learning not only how to learn who to trust and who not to trust, but also we're learning how to become more trustworthy ourselves. Because just expecting people to trust us doesn't go very far. In fact, anytime somebody says something to you like this, just trust me, probably the last thing that you're willing to do in that very moment is what? Trust them. There's all kinds of flags that go up. If somebody says, has to tell you that, you kind of wonder what's really going on. Or they're asking you to trust something that's probably going to come back to bite you in the end. Dr. Cloud says this: while trust often begins with a feeling, it cannot only be based on a feeling, an emotion, or some kind of sense. It has to be rooted in more solid, observable, essential qualities. And those essential qualities are what we're looking at based on Dr. Cloud's research. In fact, he's identified 5 essentials qualities of trust. They're understanding, motive, ability, character, and track record. And he says, listen, when it comes to trusting somebody else, 3 of 5 of these won't cut it. And in fact, he says 4 of 5 of these won't cut it. All 5 of these have to be present if we're to be trusted, as well as if we're to trust somebody else. These essentials, they work no matter what. They'll help us discover the right people to trust, and they'll also keep us from trusting the wrong people. I received an email this week from a friend, and I want to read part of it to you. Here's what it says. It says, last 2 sermons were great. I have put the 5 essentials of trust to many different situations. Having some large trees taken down, all 5 applied to the company. Changed to a different eye doctor, and after applying, quote unquote, the 5 to the former doctor, I see why I changed. She failed 4 out of the 5. He says, I applied all 5 to my wife. She passed, and here's the blessing, and she had 20 more that she passed as well. I don't know what the other 20 were, but I'd love to see them. Well, being the nice pastor, caring pastor that I am, I responded to him this way. I said, that's great, but let's hope that she doesn't apply those same essentials to you. And have a nice day. But anyway, so here's the point. And I appreciated the email because they do work in every situation. If we apply these to any, whether it's we're hiring somebody to do something where we're trying to determine if we can trust somebody, if we apply these, they work in pretty much every situation that I can think of. I've yet to find a way to really say, okay, these don't work. I have been working on this for weeks and it just makes sense. So what we've been doing is taking a practical look at how we can use these to help us know who to trust and who not to trust. Last week, we applied these to trusting God. Now, a lot of folks do not trust God, but we applied these, and if you weren't here last week and you're having trouble trusting God, I want to encourage you to go back and look at this message and listen to what we talked about last week, because I really do believe that you will find that you can trust God wholeheartedly. As we look at all 5 of these areas and all 5 of these essentials as they relate to God, God stands out and above in every single one of them. And so this week, we're going to apply them to our next relationship, and that is trusting the church. Because evidently, a lot of people do not trust the church either. In fact, a survey was taken just last year, and at the end of the survey, and again, much like the one I showed you at the beginning of the series with the government, where the chart just kind of goes down and or to the right and down instead of to the right and up, which is generally what you want to see. When it comes to trusting the church, we're down last year, less than 35% of the people surveyed said that they trusted the church or its leadership. Now, I've seen some new information for this year already, and you know that is now half of that. In 1 year, we're down to about 15% of the people surveying say that they trust the church or its leadership. So like last week, what I'd like to do is I want to go through these 5 essentials with you, and I want to apply them practically to trusting the church. But before we do that, I feel like we need to define what the church is. What is the church? A lot of people, I think, have a misunderstanding or don't ever really stop to think about what do we say, what do we mean when we say the church? Are we really just referring to that building? I have people say things to me like, the church really should do X, Y, and Z. And I'm always like, well, who is the church that you're referring to? Because often, whether they realize it or not, they are that church. Now, the idea of church is first introduced to us in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 16. In fact, Jesus is the first one to introduce it. And so I'll set it up. So Jesus has been teaching. He's got these followers that are following him. And one day he stops and he says, hey guys, I got a question for you. He says, who do people say that I am? To which they had some pretty interesting comments. He said, here's what they said. Some people say that you're John the Baptist. Others say that you're Elijah. Still others, Jeremiah, or one of the great prophets from the past. To which Jesus said, okay, that's great, but let me make this a little bit more personal. He says, who do you say that I am? To which Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. What a declaration to say. I'm not sure that he fully understood it, but whatever prompted him to say that, here's what Jesus said. He says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And then he says this, and this is where this gets interesting. He says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my what? My church. What rock is he talking about? I believe with all of my heart, he's talking about this declaration that Peter makes. When he says, who do you say that I am? Peter said, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, Peter, you're absolutely right. But he says, more than that, he says, up on this rock solid truth is what I think he's saying. I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell or the gates of Hades will not overcome it. He continues. He says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, this word church that's used in this passage in the original language is this word ecclesia. And the word means a called out assembly. Now, it wasn't first used to reference the church as we know it. This word could have been used at any time, referring, and oftentimes it was used just to, we're having a meeting. And so there's this called ecclesia, and it could have been about anything and everything. But as Jesus refers to it, he's talking about this called out assembly of people, a purposeful gathering. Now, what I think he's referring to, and as we study this, we see that in this situation, Jesus was referring to a group of people that he was about to call out to believe in something, or maybe to believe in someone, and then to build something on that belief that they had. I.e., the church. I believe that is exactly what he had in mind. This group of people, the church was never about a building. And we have to start there. We have to understand, when Jesus said, I'm going to build my church, he wasn't talking about bricks and mortar. He was talking about flesh and blood. He was talking about gathering a group of people, calling them out, and asking them to one, believe in something, but then to build on that belief as well. I think it's interesting at the end of this passage where Jesus says this, and he tells them that, you've been given the keys, you're going to build this thing. But then he says, listen, right now, I don't want you to tell anybody who I am. Just keep that between us. Now, just a few months later, this church, this assembly that Jesus talks about he's going to call out would happen. In fact, if you turn to the book of Acts, if you ever read through the book of Acts, Acts is really kind of what happens after the church is born, after the church begins to launch. And at the very beginning of the chapter, we see that Jesus calls his disciples together. He's been crucified, he was buried, he rose from the dead, and at the end of a 40-day period, he calls them together for one final conversation with them, and then he says, now, go build my church. And that's exactly what they do. In fact, Peter is the first one to give a public message to people. As he called this crowd of people gathered in the streets, he began to preach to them. And the very first thing that he tells them, which I think is phenomenal, because remember, he was told, whatever you do, don't tell anybody until I tell you it's time to do it. And so what happens when somebody tells you not to tell somebody something? You can't wait to tell them, can you? It's just like it's poison inside of us. We want to get, and so I just imagine that's where Peter was at. And so Peter, in Acts chapter 2, he stands up and he addresses the crowd and he says this. He says, therefore, let all of Israel be assured of this, that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. So it's his first time to really publicly announce who Jesus is. And at that moment, at that day, the church begins to be built. And Peter and the others begin to build it. We're told that some 3,000 people that day placed their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And the church, this ecclesia, this called out assembly of people began. Just a couple of verses down in that, we see that these new believers are gathering together, they're meeting together, they're worshiping together, they're studying together, they're praying together. And then at the very end of Acts chapter 2, it says this, and the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved. And just the 2 chapters over, on a particular day, a similar scene happens. On that day, some 5,000 people are joined the church. And so since that very beginning, up until this very moment that we're sitting here in history now, the church has been growing. And God has been adding to its numbers daily those who are being saved. Over the years, what began with a small group of people has morphed into something greater than I think any of us can comprehend or even appreciate. It is now, over the years, this ecclesia, this called out assembly, is taking on many shapes and sizes. It succeeded more in some seasons than it has in others. At times, it's done a lot of good in the world. But to be honest with you, at times it's done a lot of not good in the world, a lot of harm. At times, it's led people to Jesus. And other times, it has pushed people away. But in the end, the church always prevails because it's not a man thing, it is a God thing. Now, when we get in the way of what God's doing, no doubt we make a mess of it. But the church was never man's idea. This was God's idea from the very beginning. Now, I want to say this. We might not trust the church, but you know who does trust the church? God does. We might not trust the church, but God does. And when I say he trusts the church, I mean God trusts you and me. And that's kind of scary, isn't it? That he put his trust in us to build this incredible thing, to be a part of this credible, with all of our flaws, with all of our screw-ups, with all of our mistakes, he trusts you and me to be his church. Now, why is this important to understand? Because we are so quick to point out the shortcomings of others without ever owning our own. I want to show you a diagram here. So in the scriptures, we see that the church exists and is made up of different groups of individuals. So we're going to start with this outer circle. I don't know if you can read it, but this is the Big C church. This is the global church. And by that, I'm talking about the group of people who believe in Jesus Christ all around the world. I'm talking about people in Israel and people in Gaza. I'm talking about people in the Ukraine and Russia. I'm talking about people in the United States and in China. I'm talking about people who have placed their faith and trust in Jesus Christ in every known part of the world. That is what we call the Big C church, the global church. And we're all a part of that church. Now, we also see that scriptures kind of break the Big C church down into this next circle, which I'm going to call the local church. These local expressions, if you will, of the Big C church. And this church, like the global church, is made up of a lot of different people from all over walks of life, with all kinds of different worship styles, with all kinds of different serving styles. But the thing that they all have in common is their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And then I'm going to add this one more circle in here, and this is our church. We're part of the local churches that exist. We're also a part of the Big C church that exists. But like all the other churches, we're made up of a group of different kinds of people. People who have different skills, people who look different than us, people who are of different color, different nationalities. But we gather weekly to be encouraged and to be empowered by God to go out into our world and make a difference. That's why we exist as a church. That's what God has called us to do, to go out and work with him and build his church. Now, here's what happens. Here's where the challenge comes in. While that's what we're called to do, to go out and make a difference, and when we do that, the downside of this, or if there's a challenging side to this, I'm not going to say it's a bad side to this, it's a challenging side. You're met with people every single day who do not trust you, who do not trust the church. When they say they don't trust the church, they're not talking about that building on a corner. They're talking about people like you and me. And I can tell you, not only do they not trust you, they don't trust me either. In fact, some of you would be surprised, would be shocked by what some people I know have just of recent, couple weeks ago, have said about you, the ecclesia known as Atlee Community Church. And the reason they say these things is because they don't understand. They don't get it. They don't understand what we're about. And so what I want us to do, Our goal is to help restore that trust. And so I want to talk to really all of us, but some of us are on that side of, I'm not really sure if I trust the church, and others are like, well, how do I help people trust the church? And I think these 5 essentials will help us do that. So let's dig in like we did last week. We're going to start with the first essential, understanding. Dr. Cloud says this: trust begins not by convincing someone to trust you. It starts with someone feeling that you know them. Isn't that true of us? Trust doesn't begin by somebody trying to convince you to believe something. Trust begins when you feel like that person really understands you, understands what you're going through, and can relate to you. People need to know and feel that the church understands them, understands their questions, not put off by them, but understands them, listens to them, that the church understands their needs, what they're struggling with. People, it's been said, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And that's where most people are, especially when it comes to the church. I don't care what you know, I don't care what you believe until I know that you really care about me. 29 years ago, Atlee held its first service, before Atlee held its first service. And before that, a survey was taken, and hundreds of homes were called in our area. And the question that we were asking people is, why do you not go to church? If they said they go to church, we just moved on to the next person. But out of that survey, out of those conversations, we came up with an Atlee top 10 reason of why people don't go to church. And I just want to read this to you. The number one reason, we'll count down. So number 10 was because they didn't own a polyester suit. That was the reason. People said, I don't own a suit, and I don't fit in when I go, because in their mind, going to church meant you had to dress up. Number 9, pastors think they are God. And I'm just going to say this right up front. If you think I'm God, you're in trouble already, and so we'll just move on. Number 8, they would rather be judged in traffic court. Number 7, they relate more to jazz and rock than Handel and Bach. That kind of rhymes, doesn't it? I like that one. Number 6, they would rather sleep in bed than sleep in church. Number 5, I already went once this year. Number 4, I feel guilty enough already. Number 3, they seem more interested in my wallet than me. Number 2, Sunday morning talk shows seem more relevant. And the number 1 reason we determined that people didn't go to church was because they had not been to Atlee yet. Now, let me say this. Not much has changed. I was there when we were taking those surveys, when we got the results from that. I was there when we launched the church. And so here we are 29, almost 30 years later, and I still wrestle with the same things, same struggles, same questions, same objections that people have when it comes to church. I also want to say this. We designed this church around people's concerns. You don't see me wear suit and ties. If you do, it's a funeral or wedding. Somebody says, I don't know if there's a difference in that, but there is, trust me. Listen, we wanted people to know that we understood. And that's why we created this church. I'll give you another practical example. The very first Sunday, as we met, we passed an offering box, an offering plate. And something about it felt odd. And so we gathered afterwards and said, how did we think it went? And we said there was just this one piece that just felt odd. We took this survey. This is what people said. How can we help, get rid of that? And so we decided that from that day on, we would not pass a plate. And so we put up offering boxes, just like we have here, have in Scottsville. And that, until online giving became a big deal, that was the way that people gave their offering. But that let people know that we weren't here for their money. That's not what this was about. And so we designed this church with those kind of people in mind. We wanted them to know that we understood. Now, when I think of the Big C Church, I think there's some things that all of us need to understand if this is going to work. And so I want to look at something that Paul taught thousands of years ago based on the teachings of Christ. Here's what he said in Romans chapter 3. He says, there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. What a way to start. He writes to a local church, a local group of people who are trying to figure this church thing out. And he says, for this to work, for people to understand you and for them to, or you to understand them, you need to understand there is no difference between, he uses the word Jew and Gentile. We could substitute just about any combination of words in there. There's no difference between blacks and whites. There's no difference between gay and straight. Whatever word you want to put in there, this would be applicable. This is what he's saying. There's no difference. For all, everybody say, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All of us, myself included, have fallen short of the glory of God because we've sinned. Sin simply means we missed the mark of God's perfection. Sin means we've turned our back on God and believe that our way is better than his way. Sin is anything in our lives that stands in contrast to God. And every single one of us are guilty of this. It's imperative that we understand this. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And all, everybody say all, are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. All of us are saved the same way. All of us find salvation through faith and trust in Jesus Christ. That is true of every single one of us. He continues, he says, wait a minute, that is my last slide for that, isn't it, Kevin? Sorry about that. Listen, here's the deal. I'm about 3 lines down in my message in my head. Until we, the church, understand this, nobody's ever going to trust us. Now, I can flip that around and say until they understand that, they will never trust us as well. We all have to understand this because it is true of every single one of us. Now, I could go on there, but let's move on to motives. Motives. What motivates us, the ecclesia, to do what we do? Again, I want to turn to the teachings of Paul. Here's what he says. For Christ's love compels us. Why are we trying to build this church? Why are we sharing Jesus with people? Why are we filling shoe boxes? Why are we packing backpacks? Because God's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but live for him who died for them and was raised again. He continues, so from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Can we just stop there a second? Even though he says, though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Here's what he's saying. Listen, we used to look at each other and go, there's a difference between you and me. And there's something more wrong with you than maybe there's more wrong with me. And Paul says we can't do that anymore. If we understand what Jesus said, that there's no difference, we're all sinners, then we will regard nobody from a worldly standpoint, but from a heavenly standpoint, that we are all created by God in the likeness of God. And every single one of us have value, no matter who we are. He says we even regarded Christ at one point that way. Before we believed and understood Jesus to be who he was, before the resurrection from the dead, we questioned, okay, is he really who he claims to be? I'm not really sure about that. But then he came back from the dead and we're like, man, if he can do that, then there must be something to this. He continues, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. Continuing, he says, all this is from God who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. If Jesus wasn't, and God wasn't counting people's sins against them, then why do we do that? Is there any wonder sometimes the world doesn't trust the church? Because sometimes I don't think we understand who we are and what God has done in our lives. I think we're missing out on that as well. And he continues and says this, and he has committed to us, the church, that's the us in this, to you and me, the message of reconciliation. You know why? We might not trust the church, But God trusts the church, and he committed to us this message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. So therefore we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. That is not just our message, but that is our motive. That's why we, as the church of Jesus Christ, do what we do. Next on the list, ability. You've heard me say from this stage that the church is the hope of the world. But does it have the ability to deliver that hope? Ephesians 3:20 and 21 says this. Now to him who is able, him being God, him being Jesus, the person who created this thing, is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within who? Us, you and me. To him be glory in the church. Again, when you hear that word, to him be glory in the church, he's not talking about a building. He's talking about you and me. He's talking about this group of individuals who have placed their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And he says, in us and through us be this glory. To him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus through all generations, forever and ever and ever and ever. Remember, the church is not a man thing. It's a God thing. And because of that, it has the ability to do things that we could only imagine. It has the ability to do things that we can't even imagine because it's not powered by us. It's powered by God. Character, next on our list, character. Now, this is a big one. Let's face it, the church hasn't always displayed the best character. And even when it does, there are people who push back against us because, again, they don't understand us. Followers of Christ take pride in this label that's been given to us, and that label is Christians. As a follower of Christ, as the church, we are referred to as Christians, and that word means Christ-like. Do you know that when that word was first introduced into the world, if you will, that it was not a positive thing? It was used in a very derogatory sense. In fact, so I've told you the book of Acts kind of lays out the beginning of the church, and we see it from its conception up until years later as the church is spreading around the world. There's this one story in the middle of Acts. There's two missionaries. One we talk about a lot, a guy named Paul, and another one, Barnabas. And let me go ahead and bring up that verse for me. It says, then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. So they have spread themselves out as missionaries. They're out sharing the gospel, trying to build God's church, and so they want to come together. And so Barnabas goes looking for Paul, finds him in Tarsus, and while he found him, he brought him to Antioch. And so for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. When people looked at this growing group of people, they were leery of them. They didn't trust them. And they called them Christians. They're those Christian people over there. Now, sometimes when that word is used against us, it's not always in a positive way either, is it? Okay? Because, unfortunately, our character has not always lived up to what that word means. The word Christian means Christ-likeness. And so when it comes to the character of the church, our character should be one of Christ-likeness. We talked about God and his character last week. Go back and look at that section of the message. That should be true of you and me as well. There's a certain character that we should display as followers of Christ. When people look at us, they might not buy into it. They might be skeptical. They might be like, oh, those Christians over there. But it's because they don't understand. And so we've got to help them understand that we understand them because we are one of them. And if our character matches that of Christ, we will eventually convince them otherwise. All right, last one, track record. Track record. Do you know that in spite of all the church's mistakes, that it's made over the years, it still remains the one thing that continues to be a force for all that is true and right in this world. The church is responsible for hospitals. It was the church who created the first hospital. It was the church who created some of the world's best institutions of learning, colleges. It's the church who's always there on the front lines when it comes to disaster relief. And you know who's always left when everybody else pulls out and goes home? The church is the one that's left doing good in those communities. It's the church that day after day meets with people to let them know that not only do we understand, but God understands, and he offers help for all their hurts and their bad habits and their hang-ups. It's the church who's always there. It's the church that is the only one who has the answers to life's toughest questions. Remember, the gospel is not only good news, it is the only good news. It is the best good news ever, because it does, and it answers all of man's questions. Church history has some bumps in the road. We talked about this the first week when we first identified these. We said that when it comes to a track record and you look back, you're going to find almost in everybody's life there's some bumps in the road. Nobody's going to be perfect when you look at their track record. But what you're looking at is not just those bumps in the road, but you're looking for that hard-worn path that's been created over time. And this is true of the church. The church has some bumps in the road. Our church has some bumps in the road. But if you look back past the 28, 29 years now that we've been here, while we're not perfect, we have been consistent to be who we started to be. We've been consistent to try to understand people and help the people know that we understand them, that we're one of them, that God loves them just as much as he loves us. Paul, writing to a local church, said this. He says, I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from this day until now. There's a track record. Being confident of this, that he, God, who began a good work in you, will carry it on unto completion until the day of Jesus Christ. Why can we be confident of that? Because the church is not a man thing. It's a God thing. And because God trusts the church, we can trust the church. Because God trusts you and me. I want to go back to this illustration that I showed you up front. I've added another circle. We think of the Big C church, we think of the local church, we think of our local gathering, this ecclesia called Atlee, but right in the middle is another individual that makes up the church, and that's you. And it's me. And so I point this out because here's the deal. I get that there are people, and maybe it's even some of you, who don't trust these other people. And yet you're letting those other people stand in the way of God using you to be his church. And so at the end of the day, when we choose not to trust and we choose not to participate and we make all these excuses, are we really any better off than those people that we say we can't trust, that aren't trustworthy? When we let them keep us from being who God has created us to be, who's empowered us to be, who has commissioned us to be, and we don't step forward. Maybe we own our own junk to begin with, our own shortcomings. But then we say, okay, God, you trust the church, and I'm that church, and so you trust me. So help me be trustworthy. In an article, and I'll close with this, Lauren Sandretti, she wrote answering the question. The article was titled, What is Church? And she begins by asking these questions. She says, what is church to you? A building, a denomination, hypocrites, kind people, weak people, people who think they are perfect, who enforce, follow, and or break rules. She says, I'm learning that the church is all of these things and more. Church is a complicated mix of good and bad, light and dark, love and hate. She says, I know this about the church not because I work at a church or I'm a member of a church or because I'm in seminary. She says, I know this because I am the church. I remember reading that and thinking, I wonder how many of us can own that, can look at this and go, I am the church. You are the church. If you placed your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, you are that church. So I'm going to ask you to stand with me. I'm going to close this in prayer. My prayer is going to be very simple this morning. And that is that you and I, as the church, would live up to the label, to the name that describes who we are. Father, this morning, I thank you for the reminder. I know just in my own life, God, I am that church. And any issues I have with that church, I have with myself. God, in your wisdom, you trust us individually. You've made us a part of your church. I am your church. God, that is true of every single one of us who've placed our faith and trust in you. God, help us to be that church. God, help us to show that we understand, that you understand. God, help us to do our part in building your church by living up to the name that's been assigned to us, that we are Christ-like. Lord, I love you, I praise you, and I thank you for the privilege that I get to speak into the lives of the people at this local ecclesia, the church called Atlee Community Church. Father, use us, and I pray and ask this in Christ's name, and we all agree together and said, amen. God bless you guys. We'll see you next Sunday.